Have you ever wondered why silence can be louder than words? Why the absence of a voice, a look, a touch can unravel the strongest of men? She said nothing, and that's what broke him. Not because she was cruel or uncaring, but because her quiet was a mirror to a truth he never dared face, the emptiness inside himself, the shadow he refused to meet. In that stillness, where words fell away, a deeper dialogue began, a dance of ego and soul, desire and despair, power and surrender. When a woman chooses silence, it is not merely a lack of sound. It is an ancient language, woven into the fabric of feminine power, a language that speaks directly to the unconscious. Carl Jung understood that the feminine is the realm of mystery, of depths unplumbed by logic or reason. Her silence is not absence, but presence, a force that reverberates through the masculine psyche like a haunting melody. It unsettles, disorients, and ultimately demands confrontation with the self. He thought he could win her back with words, pleas, explanations, even promises. But words are a flimsy currency when shadow work calls for raw honesty. In his attempts to fill the void she left, he projected his fears, his wounds, his ego's desperate need for control. The silence pierced through this facade, stripping away the masks he wore so tightly. It forced him into a confrontation he never expected, a reckoning with his own unhealed fractures. This silence is the echo of the woman's own journey toward individuation, the process Jung described as the soul's path to wholeness. When she stopped waiting for him, stopped explaining, stopped pleading, she stepped into her own power. She became the enigma he could no longer possess, the shadow he feared to face. Her quiet was a challenge, a mirror reflecting his own inability to be whole without her. What breaks a man is not the silence itself, but what it reveals. In her stillness, he saw his reflection not as a lover, but as a fragmented self, clinging to attachments, haunted by ego, terrified of emptiness. She said nothing, but her silence screamed the truth that no charm, no logic, no manipulation could drown out. He must change or lose her forever. This is the dark but honest advice that Jung would whisper to every man who feels broken by a woman's silence. You are not broken because of her, but because of your refusal to face your shadow. The ego's desperate grip on control is the true prison. Only by surrendering the need to possess, by embracing vulnerability and emotional detachment, can a man begin to heal. For the woman, silence is her shield and her sword. It is a refusal to participate in the drama of neediness and dependence. She speaks volumes by speaking none. This power unsettles the masculine ego, which thrives on action, on conquest, on voice. When that voice is silenced, the man confronts his own inner void, the place where fear, regret, and desire collide. Her silence is also a boundary, an invisible line drawn in the sand that says, I will not sacrifice my worth for your validation. In this act of self-respect, she rewrites the dynamics of attraction. She becomes a living paradox, both present and absent, tender and fierce, accessible and unknowable. This paradox ignites a fire in the man's unconscious, awakening a longing that is as much about self-discovery as it is about her. Imagine the internal storm he faces. The echo of her silence triggers his primal need to fix, to explain, to reclaim. Yet every attempt pushes her further away, deepening the silence. This cycle is the crucible of transformation, a test of his capacity to evolve beyond old patterns of control and attachment. Only by embracing the mystery of her silence, by relinquishing his illusions, can he move toward authentic connection. In that silence, she invites him to listen, not to words, but to the unspoken language of soul and shadow. She beckons him to confront the parts of himself he has long ignored: the wounded child, the fearful lover, the fractured ego. This is not an easy path. It demands courage, patience, and a willingness to endure the discomfort of emptiness. What if the silence is not a rejection but an initiation? A sacred pause in which both must face their inner truths. The man who dares to stay in that silence, who resists the urge to fill it with noise, begins to glimpse the contours of his own soul. He learns that desire is not about possession but presence, not about control but surrender. She said nothing, and in that nothingness, everything shifted. The power dynamics inverted, the old scripts unraveled. She became less an object to be won, and more a mirror reflecting the man's deepest fears and potentials. Her silence was a call to awaken, to transcend ego, to enter the sacred dance of feminine and masculine energies. If you find yourself broken by silence, do not rush to fill it. Instead, lean into it. Let it become your teacher. Observe how your mind races, how your heart aches, how your soul stirs. This is the alchemy of transformation, the dark night of the ego before the dawn of true individuation. The woman's silence is not the end but the beginning. It is the gate through which both must pass to find a love that is not possession but freedom. It is a test of character, a call to grow, and an invitation to know yourself beyond desire and fear. The one who breaks is not weaker, but closer to becoming whole. The silence she holds is not emptiness, but a sacred space, an echo of the eternal feminine that calls every man to meet himself fully, honestly, without pretense. She said nothing, and that silence spoke louder than any confession, any apology, any promise. It shattered illusions and revealed the raw, unvarnished truth. There is a sacred power in silence, a force ancient as the cosmos itself, where the feminine energy pulses beneath the surface of spoken words. When she says nothing, she is not withdrawing but reclaiming, a reclamation of her inner sovereignty and a refusal to be diminished by the chaos of the outer world. This silence disrupts the masculine ego's familiar dance of pursuit and possession, leaving him exposed to his own shadow. He stands at the edge of the abyss, confronted by a truth too long avoided, that love cannot be demanded, nor can it be owned. In the quiet, the man encounters the void that Jung described, not as emptiness to be feared, but as the fertile ground from which individuation blooms. The silence is the dark mirror reflecting his unhealed wounds, unresolved fears, and the illusions he clings to for safety. This is the place where ego dies, where the desperate need for control dissolves into acceptance. Yet few men dare linger here. Instead, they retreat, chasing echoes of what once was, unable to face the transformative power of her quiet withdrawal. Her silence is an act of profound self-love and boundary setting, a declaration that her worth is not contingent on his presence or validation. This shifts the invisible balance of power between them, awakening a primal attraction rooted not in dependence, but in respect and mystery. The masculine instinct is to fill the silence, to speak, to explain, to reclaim. But every attempt to break her quiet only deepens the enigma, forcing him to confront the limits of his control and the expansiveness of his own interior world. This is the paradox of desire. The harder he tries to possess, the more she retreats into herself. The more she holds her silence, the more potent her presence becomes. It is in this interplay that true attraction is forged, not through words, but through unspoken energies. Shadows meeting shadows in the dance of psyche and soul. Consider the echoes of Stoic philosophy here, Epictetus's wisdom that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Her silence is a test of character, a call for him to master himself rather than the situation. His reaction to this void determines whether he will rise or fall, whether he will succumb to ego's tantrums or step into the calm center of his being. In this liminal space, where words fail, the man is invited to practice emotional detachment, not as coldness, but as clarity. He learns that clinging breeds suffering, and true strength lies in surrender. When she no longer waits, no longer reaches out, the power dynamic shifts. She chooses herself first, and in doing so, becomes irresistible, not because she chases, but because she radiates a deep, unshakable peace. This transformation is echoed in Jung's notion of the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine archetypes residing within each person. Her silence stirs the animus within him, awakening aspects of strength, integrity, and vulnerability that words cannot summon. It invites him to reconcile with the masculine shadow, the parts of himself conditioned by fear, pride, and attachment. For the woman, silence is also a space of healing and reclaiming her voice on her own terms. It is a declaration that her essence cannot be bargained with or subdued. It is a refuge from the relentless noise of expectation and the drama of emotional dependence. In her quiet, she touches the divine feminine, a power that transcends the personal and connects to the collective unconscious. What he sees when she no longer needs him is not rejection, but revelation. He witnesses a woman who has stepped beyond the scripts of victimhood and craving into the sovereignty of self-possession. This image unsettles the masculine ego because it demands a new kind of love, one that is free, respectful, and rooted in mutual wholeness. Her silence is a sanctuary where he is forced to confront himself, not the fantasy lover he pursued, but the man he is beneath the mask. It is a mirror that reflects his potential as much as his wounds, challenging him to grow or walk away. The silence speaks of boundaries, integrity, and the painful beauty of loss. To embrace this silence is to begin the alchemy of transformation. It requires courage to face the void without rushing to fill it. It demands patience to listen not just with ears, but with the heart and soul. It calls for humility to surrender the ego's grip on control and to trust in the unfolding of something greater than desire alone. If you find yourself broken by her silence, know that it is not a punishment, but an invitation to deeper self-knowledge, to healing, and ultimately to a love that is not about possession, but about freedom. Her silence is the language of the soul, a call to awaken from the illusions of attachment and to meet yourself in the rawness of your own being. She said nothing, and in that nothingness, everything shifted. The story that once revolved around longing and need transformed into one of empowerment and rebirth. The silence was no longer a wound, but a doorway, an entry into a sacred space where true connection begins. This is the dance of shadow and light, of ego and soul, of masculine and feminine energies in eternal interplay. It is a dance that invites both to surrender, to grow, and to love beyond the confines of fear and control. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses. She said nothing. And that was the moment he began to hear everything he had long tried to silence within himself. Her stillness echoed through the chambers of his being, unmasking the noise he had been drowning in, the compulsive need to dominate, the hunger for affirmation, the desperate chase for external validation that kept him blind to his own emptiness. Her silence wasn't just absence, it was a rupture, a crack in the illusion of his own control where the light of truth could finally seep in. For most men, the unraveling begins not with betrayal or abandonment, but with silence. Silence from a woman who once mirrored his worth back to him, who once softened her voice to make space for his storms, who once bent her boundaries in hopes that he would eventually see her. When she goes quiet, it's not out of pettiness or manipulation, but because she has finally heard herself louder than she hears him. This kind of silence is spiritual. It is not passive. It is not weak. It is an active detachment, an earned stillness, a space she steps into not to punish, but to protect, to gather the fragments of herself once scattered across his inconsistencies, to honor her own depth over his indecision. It is in this profound quiet that she begins to reweave her story, not as a character in his tale, but as the author of her own. The feminine has long been expected to explain, to accommodate, to soothe the masculine's unrest with endless words and emotional labor. But silence breaks this ancient pattern. Silence becomes her revolution. In that silence, he no longer hears her validating voice, her soft reassurances, her empathic attempts to meet him halfway while abandoning herself. Instead, he hears the void of his own neglect, of her, yes, but more deeply, of himself. He starts to see it now, not just her absence, but her essence. The way she used to turn toward him with eyes full of hope, the way she once asked for emotional availability with trembling vulnerability, the way she made room for him in the temple of her heart long after he had taken it for granted. He sees it all not because she said anything, but because she stopped trying to be heard. And in that stopping, she becomes deafening. Her quiet presence now radiates a kind of power he never expected, a sovereignty that confuses him. She's no longer holding her breath for his apology. She's not refreshing her phone. She's not composing unsent messages in her mind. She's living, breathing, rebuilding herself in her own image. And it disorients him, because he was never taught that a woman could be whole without his permission. In this disorientation, he is forced to confront the internal mother wound, the anima he projected onto her, the deep yearning for unconditional nurturing that he unconsciously expected her to fulfill. But now she's no longer playing that role. She has stepped out of the archetype. She is no longer here to mother him into manhood. Her silence marks the end of that illusion. And in that ending, he is both lost and called. The feminine silence becomes the mirror. He sees the boy inside him, wounded, reactive, hungry for affirmation, but terrified of vulnerability. Her quiet no longer gives him a place to hide from this reflection. He must either meet the man in himself or run from it forever. And this is where many falter. Some lash out. They call her cold, heartless, manipulative, because it's easier to vilify her silence than to ask why it hurts so deeply. Others retreat, folding into other distractions, hoping to forget the echo she left behind. But the rare few, the ones on the path to real growth, will sit in that silence long enough to learn. They'll begin to ask the right questions. Who am I without her affirmation? Why did I need her to carry my emotional burdens? What do I fear in her stillness? This is the fire of transformation. The very thing he thought would break him, her withdrawal, is the crucible in which he must be remade. And what about her? She is not waiting. She is not checking in on his progress. She is not holding space for his awakening. She is tending to her garden, pouring into her purpose, reconnecting with the parts of herself that had been exiled for his comfort. She's not building walls. She's building altars, sacred spaces where she meets her own divinity, her own clarity, her own power. If he returns, it will not be to the same woman. The woman he knew has become a myth, a memory, a moment. She doesn't belong to the past. She belongs to herself. Because when a woman chooses silence over proving her worth, she stops begging to be understood and starts understanding herself. She doesn't wait to be chosen. She becomes the one who chooses. She said nothing, but her silence said, "I am no longer accessible to those who do not recognize my value." And that is what broke him. Not the loss of her presence, but the confrontation with his own blindness. ChatGPT Noi, there is a certain alchemy in the silence of a woman who once gave everything. It transforms the air around her, it thickens with meaning, with consequence. To him, it once felt like withdrawal. But now, in retrospect, he understands. It was a resurrection. Not away from him, but toward herself. He begins to remember the moments he overlooked, the subtle shifts in her energy, the times her eyes lost their shine mid-conversation, the soft sighs she released in place of words, hoping he might notice. But he didn't. And now those sighs haunt him more than any scream would have, because there is nothing more chilling than the realization that someone stopped fighting, not out of weakness, but because they realized you were never listening. This is the silent threshold where many women arrive. After the last apology, unspoken, after the final plea caught in the throat, after the final emotional contortion made to keep the connection alive. It's not that she stopped caring. It's that she finally started caring about herself more. And the man, he is left to witness the unraveling of everything he projected onto her. The muse, the savior, the emotional caretaker, the one who held his chaos without judgment. When she goes quiet, he sees her no longer as an extension of his needs, but as a mystery he never bothered to understand. That mystery now haunts him, not because she's gone, but because he never truly saw her when she was there. This is what happens when a woman withdraws her energy, her emotional labor, her psychological attunement. The entire dynamic collapses, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The scaffolding that once held his sense of stability crumbles. He has no idea how much of himself was dependent on her quiet strength until it's no longer available to him. She, however, is not crumbling. She is blooming. In silence, she rediscovers the parts of her that were dimmed in the relationship. She reconnects with her inner archetypes, the warrior who defends her boundaries, the queen who rules her own life, the mystic who listens to her inner knowing. Each aspect of her that had been fragmented in service to his needs now returns home. She integrates, heals, and reclaims. Not through loud declarations, but through sacred stillness. You see, silence isn't empty. It's full of answers, full of revelations. For her, it becomes the space in which she no longer has to explain her worth. For him, it becomes the echo chamber in which all his avoidances are amplified. Her silence speaks in the voice of every woman he ever took for granted, every wound he never faced, every shadow he refused to own. He starts to realize that he wasn't broken by her leaving, but by the absence of her attention. Her attention was never light. It was a form of devotion, a constant reading of his moods, a quiet adapting to his wounds. Now that attention is turned inward, he's left outside the gates of her world, knocking on a door that no longer opens with his old keys. And this is where the deeper psychology reveals itself. What breaks him is not just loss. It is the confrontation with the feminine principle within himself, the anima, no longer mirrored by her caretaking. It's the symbolic death of his illusion that he can receive love without ever earning it, that he can demand understanding while refusing to understand, that he can be the center of her universe without ever asking her what stars she had to extinguish to orbit his gravity. It is a collapse of entitlement. It is a reckoning. But for the woman, it is rebirth. In her silence, she no longer negotiates her value. She no longer makes herself smaller to protect his ego. She no longer bleeds herself dry in the name of love. She becomes sovereign, not cold, but clear, not hardened, but whole. And her energy changes everything. Where once she asked for love, now she radiates it. Where once she yearned to be chosen, now she chooses herself. This terrifies him more than rage, more than tears, because he knows now, deep in his bones, that there is no manipulation in her silence, no game, no threat. It's pure clarity. She doesn't need to prove anything anymore. And when a woman no longer needs to prove herself, she becomes untouchable to the man who only valued her when she was uncertain. He sees it now. In every quiet step she takes away from his chaos, in every unspoken boundary, in every moment she chooses her peace over his approval. And for the first time he's left to wonder, not what she will say next, but if she will ever speak to him again. ChatGPT John Noy. He replays it all now, obsessively. Each moment she almost walked away, every time her eyes glazed over mid-sentence, every soft nod she gave when she had nothing left to argue. He thought silence meant forgiveness. He thought stillness meant surrender. But what he failed to realize is that silence, in her world, was the funeral of her tolerance. She did not leave in anger. She left in awareness. And that is what shatters him. Because when a woman walks away in anger, there's still a thread. Rage is attachment inverted. But when she walks away in clarity, in peace, in absolute silence, there is nothing left to grab, nothing left to fix, nothing left to dominate or redeem. She is not playing a game. She is not making a point. She has simply become untouchable. He tries to reach her through old tactics, provocation, nostalgia, even sudden vulnerability, but nothing works. Her silence isn't designed to teach him a lesson. It's not an act of revenge. It is the sound of evolution. This is where men are forced to confront themselves, to look directly into the void that once was filled by her empathy, her patience, her presence. Now that void reflects only their own emotional emptiness, the same emotional absence they blamed her for when she began to pull back, the same neglect they projected onto her when she stopped performing the emotional labor he mistook for love. But she no longer dances in his projections. She no longer plays the part he cast her in. In her absence, he begins to see the shape of his own shadow, the unhealed boy who feared abandonment yet created it with his coldness, the ego that demanded worship yet offered no sanctuary, the man who wanted her softness but mocked her sensitivity, who craved her loyalty but fed her confusion. He sees now that what broke him wasn't her silence. It was the mirror that silence became, a mirror that did not lie. He sees himself, not as he fantasized, but as he was. And this, more than anything, is what he cannot bear. Because for the first time, he is no longer the hero of the story. He is not the one who was wronged. He is not the one abandoned. He is the one who, over time, became so emotionally bankrupt that her only option was silence. And she, meanwhile, is not grieving anymore. She has moved beyond the phase where she needs him to understand. She has burned through the sorrow, through the bargaining, through the ache of being unseen. Now she walks in quiet power, not because she no longer feels, but because she finally feels for herself. In her silence, there is ancient wisdom, the wisdom of every woman who once twisted herself into someone else's idea of enough, the wisdom of every mother who was never mothered, every lover who was never loved back in full. She carries the voices of women before her, who stayed too long, who gave too much, who forgot their own names trying to be someone else's everything. And now she remembers. And in remembering, she becomes free. Not loud, not violent, not theatrical, just free. He watches her become what he never imagined, whole without him. And that is what breaks him, over and over again. That the woman he thought he could always return to no longer waits for him in the ruins. That the woman he tried to reduce now expands beyond recognition. That the silence he once dismissed now roars in his ears louder than any scream. And still she says nothing. But her nothing is everything. Because it says, I saw myself drowning and chose to breathe. It says, I waited too long for you to show up, and then I showed up for myself. It says, my love was never the problem. Your inability to hold it was. And the finality of it all is that there is no going back. No apology that can unsee what has been seen. No gesture that can rethread the severed cord. Her silence is the closing of a door that once stood open far too long. A door he mistook for a revolving one. A door he now cannot find his way through, not because it's locked, but because she's removed the entire frame. So he sits with what she left behind. Not rage, not blame, not even a goodbye. Just silence, and the quiet, unbearable truth of who he became in the absence of her light. There is a moment, one he never speaks of, when he walks past a place where they once stood together. It might be a street corner, a bookstore, the faded wood of a coffee shop table worn smooth by fingertips and time. Nothing dramatic happens. No music swells, no ghost appears, but his chest tightens with something he cannot explain. And that is when he knows she is gone. Not just physically, not just in body, but in soul, in spirit, in every fiber of her being that once curled itself into the crevices of his world. He thought her silence was temporary. He thought her withdrawal was a phase. But this is different. This is exile, self-chosen, sacred, irreversible. What broke him was not her leaving. What broke him was that she never looked back. Because somewhere deep inside, he always believed she would. That she would soften, eventually. That her heart, so tender and loyal, would override her dignity. That the part of her still clinging to hope would outweigh the part of her that had learned to let go. But what he underestimated, what men like him always underestimate, is the woman who has faced herself in the mirror and refused to lie any longer. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she started loving herself. And that love, that rare, wild, sovereign thing, was not loud or flashy. It was not born from spite. It was born from exhaustion. It rose like dawn after a long night of begging for breadcrumbs. It rose like a tide reclaiming her own shoreline. When a woman reaches that place of deep reclamation, there is no longer a war to fight. She does not raise her voice. She does not defend her choice. She does not rehearse the reasons in her head. She simply walks away with silence as her only companion and peace as her reward. She becomes the one who sees without needing to be seen, and that terrifies him, because he begins to understand that his power never came from his presence. It came from her belief in it, and now that belief is gone. Now that illusion is broken. He stands alone, surrounded by all the versions of himself she used to soothe, to heal, to hold. And without her light, those versions turn to shadow. Without her patience, his charm grows hollow. Without her reflection, he sees the truth. He was never whole to begin with. That truth is brutal, not because it is cruel, but because it is honest. He cannot unsee it now. Not in her absence, not when the silence she left behind still echoes with every conversation he avoided, every wound he ignored, every moment he chose pride over presence. And yet she does not hate him. That too breaks him, because hate would mean attachment. Hate would mean she is still dancing in the drama. But her silence is not hate. It is transcendence. It is the space beyond retribution. It is the final, unmistakable sign that she has nothing left to prove, not to him, not to the world, not even to herself. And so he wanders, not through cities or relationships, but through memory, through all the invisible places she once lived in his life, the way her laugh filled the corners of a room, the scent she left on a sweater, the softness of her hand when she tried, one last time, to reach him in his coldness. He didn't see it then, but he sees it now. And that is the curse, because her silence is no longer empty. It is a full and radiant absence, a presence that haunts him precisely because it no longer belongs to him. A quiet, elegant proof that she was never the weak one. She was the soul who carried the weight of their emotional labor until she couldn't anymore. The fire who warmed him until he mistook it for the sun. The voice who spoke truth until silence became the only mercy left. Now she speaks only through her absence, and in that absence, she becomes mythic, archetypal. She is no longer the woman he knew. She is the woman who chose herself. He may search for her in others, may look for pieces of her in every fleeting connection. But no one will sound like her silence. No one will teach him what her quiet departure did. And no one, no matter how bright, how beautiful, how available, will ever match the value of the woman who once waited for him to show up. And then, one day, didn't. He remembers the final moment, though it was unmarked by drama. She didn't slam a door. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply paused. And in that pause, she disappeared. A disappearance so profound it could only have come from a woman who had already grieved his absence while he stood right in front of her. That's what he never saw. That she had mourned him long before she left. She had laid flowers at the grave of their potential while he still flirted with distraction. She had whispered prayers over their broken communication while he changed the subject. She had wept silently while he played it cool. And when she finally fell silent, it wasn't out of anger. It was because there was nothing left to say. What haunts him now is not the loss of her presence, but the memory of her softness, the way she once made him believe he could be more than his numbness. He didn't know it then, but he was living off borrowed grace. Her forgiveness gave him more time. Her empathy gave him more chances. Her patience gave him more space to grow into the man she hoped he might become. But grace has an expiration date when it's not honored. And the version of her that he misses most is the one who still believed in him. That version is gone now. And the woman who remains, the one who walks with her shoulders back and her silence sharp as moonlight, is not someone who needs him. She is not punishing him. She is not trying to make him chase her. She is simply done. And in that finality lies a power he cannot touch. He once mistook her quietness for insecurity. He thought her softness was naivety, that her vulnerability was a weakness he could exploit. But he sees it now, what her silence truly was. It was sacred. It was ancient. It was the echo of every woman who had loved too hard, carried too much, stayed too long. It was the silence of the wise, of the reborn, of the unbroken. And now it is the only language she speaks. He replays it in his head, the absence of a reply, the unread message, the look in her eyes the last time they met, calm and kind, but distant, as though she had stepped behind a veil and no longer needed him to follow. It shatters something primal in him, because men like him, those who rely on a woman's emotional labor to prop up their self-worth, do not know how to exist without being needed. They mistake dependency for devotion. They confuse being essential with being loved. But when she left, she took that illusion with her. Now he must sit with himself, with the parts of him she once soothed, the boy who never felt safe, the man who never felt seen, the ego that needed worship more than it needed intimacy. These parts are now exposed, raw, loud in the silence she left behind. They scream for her, but she is no longer listening. Not out of cruelty, but out of evolution, because she didn't walk away to teach him a lesson. She walked away because she learned hers. She realized that no amount of waiting, hoping, fixing, or forgiving could make a man show up who hadn't yet met himself. She gave him everything but the journey inward. That journey he must now face alone. And here is the paradox he cannot escape. The more she said nothing, the louder his inner world became. Her silence turned the volume up on every wound he buried, every fear he denied, every failure he dressed in charm. Now, without her to absorb it, all of it rises, his chaos, his confusion, his longing. She absorbed all of it once, but now she reflects it, without words, without touch, without return. And in that reflection he sees it clearly, what he was too distracted to notice. She was the mirror, the sacred feminine that held space for his unformed masculine, the divine balance, the storm wrapped in stillness, the chaos disguised as grace. And when she withdrew, he didn't just lose her, he lost himself. Or at least, the version of himself she allowed him to believe he was. That's what broke him, not her silence, but what it revealed. Because now, there is no illusion left, no place to hide, no comfort in distraction, only the echo of everything he never said, everything he refused to feel, everything he thought would wait forever. But nothing eternal waits for the unwilling. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. There's a distinct kind of emptiness that follows a woman's silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. It lingers. It haunts. It replaces noise with a mirror, and in that mirror, he finally sees what she carried. He sees the weight of conversations that she held together with grace and grit, while he minimized her concerns. He sees the 1,000 invisible sacrifices she made, adjusting herself, shrinking her needs, dimming her brilliance, just to keep the connection alive. He sees how often she tried to meet him where he was, only to find he was never willing to meet her in return. But he sees it all too late, because now her silence is not an invitation for him to speak. It's a statement. It says, "I no longer explain myself to those who refuse to understand me." It says, "Your recognition came too late, and I've already outgrown the need for it." It says, "The woman you abandoned while she was loyal has evolved into a woman who is loyal to herself." That realization cuts deeper than any goodbye. What devastates him is not her departure. It's that she found peace in it. Not revenge, not bitterness, not even sadness, just peace. A quiet, dignified peace that no longer includes him. He had always assumed she'd wait, that her love meant permanence, that if he ever wanted to come back, she'd still be standing there. Open arms, open heart, open wounds. But her silence says otherwise. It says, "I healed in your absence. I made a home in my own soul. And the woman you left behind no longer lives here." He didn't know that silence could be this loud. That indifference could pierce deeper than rage. That apathy could feel like abandonment. But that's the difference between a woman who is hurt and a woman who is done. The first still fights. The second lets go. And letting go was her final act of love for herself. What he sees now is a woman no longer driven by the need to be chosen. She is beyond that. Her self-worth no longer dangles from his validation. Her sense of beauty isn't tied to whether or not he desires her. Her depth is no longer something she's offering to someone who only knows how to swim in shallow waters. And this terrifies him, because the masculine in its unevolved state is drawn to chaos it can control. But when the feminine becomes sovereign, when it stops orbiting around him and becomes its own sun, he loses gravity. He loses the pull. He loses the power. What broke him wasn't that she yelled or cried or pleaded. What broke him was that she no longer needed to. She became a woman of few words, but each word became sacred. She no longer sends the paragraph. She sends the period. She no longer explains. She observes. She no longer initiates. She receives. And in this quiet reclamation, she became a mystery he can no longer access. Men who are used to being the center of a woman's world cannot handle becoming a footnote in her story. And that's what her silence made him. A page she closed. A chapter she finished. not with bitterness, but with reverence for what she learned. And she did learn. Oh, she learned. She learned that love is not rescue, that kindness must be matched, not consumed, that empathy, when unreciprocated, becomes self-abandonment. She learned that her softness was never the problem. It was just offered to someone too hardened to hold it. And now, the same silence that broke him is the silence that healed her. She no longer reacts. She responds only to what aligns with her peace. She no longer seeks to prove her worth. She knows it, walks with it, breathes it. She no longer hopes he'll change. She understands now that change must come from within, and that his soul's journey is not hers to complete. So she blesses him from afar, with no malice, with no lingering hope. Just the deep knowing that love doesn't always end in togetherness. Sometimes it ends in truth, and the truth is this: she is no longer waiting to be heard. She said nothing, and that silence became the most articulate thing she ever offered him. He doesn't realize at first what's missing. At first, it feels like peace, a kind of quiet he thought he wanted. But over time, the silence begins to speak. It echoes off the walls of his own mind. It follows him into the night. It sits beside him when he checks his phone and sees nothing from her. No questions, no updates, no reminders that someone, somewhere, is still holding a space for him. That absence becomes the presence, because he was never prepared for the version of her who no longer reaches out. He was prepared for her emotions, for her fire, for her voice, the one that had once called him out and called him home in the same breath. He was prepared for her empathy, for the way she forgave without making him earn it. But he was never prepared for her distance. He underestimated the quiet power of a woman who has reclaimed her center. And now he's watching from the outside. She moves through life not in bitterness, but in full-bodied grace. She laughs in photographs he's no longer a part of. She surrounds herself with people who value presence over potential. She has a glow, not the kind you get from skincare or lighting, but the kind that only emerges when you've cried the last tear over someone and realized your life is better without the confusion. And this unsettles him, because he thought he was unforgettable. That's the shadow most men carry when they haven't done the inner work, the belief that their return will always be met with open arms. But the truth is, when a woman stops needing you, truly stops, she doesn't hate you. She doesn't love you. She transcends you. You are no longer the force that shapes her tides. You are just a lesson, a memory, a reflection of who she used to be when she didn't know how much she was worth. And he sees it now, not just in what she says, but in what she doesn't. Her silence is sacred ground. He can't step there anymore. Not because she blocked him, not because she slammed the door, but because she no longer feels the need to keep it open. He could knock, and maybe she would answer, but the warmth would be gone. The fire that once roared just for him has been redirected inward, toward her own life, her own growth, her own unfolding. And in that unfolding, she became the kind of woman he can't touch anymore. Not because she's unreachable, but because he never learned how to meet her at her depth. She no longer waters desserts. She no longer builds bridges toward people who burn them. She no longer bleeds for those who call her wounds too much. And in this reclamation, she is no longer accessible in the way he remembers. Because she's changed, not on the outside, but in the marrow of her being. She no longer performs for love. She attracts it. She no longer explains her standards. She embodies them. She no longer waits for the text, the apology, the realization. She lives as though it already came, and then decided it wasn't enough. And this is what breaks him, because there was a time when she would have taken him back in a heartbeat. One apology, one confession, one promise. That's all it would have taken. But he waited too long. And the woman she became in his absence is not the woman who waited. She is the woman who left herself behind to love him and swore never to do it again. She is the woman who knows that love without reciprocity is just another way to disappear. She is the woman who understands now. Silence is not passive. It is power. It is presence. It is a boundary so loud that even those who once ignored her voice cannot help but hear it. And what he hears now is this: she did not need revenge. She did not need closure. She did not need to prove anything. She just needed time. Time to remember who she was before he taught her to doubt it. And in that remembrance, she rose. Not to show him what he lost, but to finally live as though she was never lost at all. He used to think her silence was weakness. That if she stopped calling, if she stopped explaining, if she stopped reaching, then she must be broken, must be hurting, must be hoping he'd show up and fix it, because that's what the world teaches men like him, that the woman who withdraws is still waiting, that her distance is a game, that her stillness is submission in disguise. But this time it isn't. This time her silence is not a question, it's an answer. She has no anger left, no words stored up, no need to rehash the past or translate her worth into sentences he might finally understand. And that unnerves him, because in her stillness, he sees something terrifying. She's no longer trying to be understood. She is no longer living in the hope that someone else's recognition will validate her existence. She's not hiding, she's evolving. Her silence is the result of healing, not hiding. It's the clarity that comes after the chaos. It's the breath after the breakdown. It's the space a woman holds when she has stopped trying to be chosen and has started choosing herself. And now, she's no longer accessible in the ways that used to soothe his ego. He remembers the way she used to light up when his name appeared on her screen, how she used to wait, soft, patient, forgiving, hoping he'd show up differently. But she has outgrown that hope. Not because she stopped believing in love, but because she started believing in herself more. And that belief, unyielding, unapologetic, is what shakes him now. Because he no longer has the power to stir her soul. He no longer gets to witness her vulnerability, her longing, her wide-open heart. What he sees now is a fortress built not from bitterness, but from boundaries. And she didn't build them to keep people out. She built them to keep herself in. He sees her surrounded by peace, not people. He sees her smile, not perform. He sees her dance not for attention but for liberation. And that subtle, powerful transformation is what unravels him. Because somewhere deep in his unconscious, beneath the armor of pride, beneath the projections and avoidance, he always expected her to need him. Maybe not in desperate ways, but in subtle ones, in moments of uncertainty, in choices that required reassurance, in silences that begged for rescue. But now she's past rescue, because she was never drowning, she was rebirthing. What he doesn't understand is that when a woman truly turns inward, she becomes untouchable, not because she's guarded, but because she's grounded. She no longer flinches at absence. She no longer panics at unanswered calls. She no longer begs for clarity. She creates it. And the man who once occupied her thoughts now becomes an echo in her story. A chapter she doesn't deny, but one she no longer rereads. Because when a woman has done the work, when she has stared down her shadows and confronted her codependency, she no longer trades her silence for someone else's comfort. She lets the silence speak for itself. And this is what breaks him. Not her cruelty, not her detachment, not her indifference, but her wholeness, because it reflects back to him everything he was unwilling to become. She is no longer his mirror. She is no longer the receptacle for his projections. She is no longer the soft place where his wounds could rest unchallenged. And that loss of comfort, of ego, of emotional invisibility, is what burns now. He begins to realize that her silence isn't about him. It never was. It's about the sacredness of her energy, the decision to stop pouring herself into places that couldn't hold her, the maturity to walk away without slamming the door, the wisdom to say, "I deserve more," without shouting it. And as he watches her rise, he begins to sense the truth. She was never waiting for him. She was waiting for herself. And now that she's found her, no one, not even the man she once loved, can take her away again. He didn't lose her the day she left. He lost her the day she realized she could leave and still be whole. Because true departure doesn't always come with slammed doors or harsh words. Sometimes it comes in the quiet shifting of energy, in the subtle reclaiming of power, in the internal vow she makes to herself, not to prove anything, but to protect everything she finally understands about her worth. And what broke him wasn't her rage. It was her release. It was the way she untied the knots without ceremony, the way she no longer needed to be heard to know her truth, the way she stopped participating in conversations that only repeated pain. There was no announcement, no ultimatum, no performance, only presence, only peace. And peace, for a man who once fed on her chaos, is unbearable. Because when she stops chasing, he starts unraveling. When she stops reacting, he starts hearing his own echoes. When she stops needing him, he begins to question the weight of his presence. Not because she made him feel small, but because she stopped making him feel anything at all. He begins to notice the hollow space where her emotional labor used to live. No more late-night calls to soothe his storms. No more texts to check in when he disappeared. No more decoding his silences or excusing his shadows. She's not angry anymore. She's just unavailable. Not out of spite, but out of sacred discernment. And that's what shakes the foundation of a man who only knew how to be significant through someone else's sacrifice. Because in her silence, he sees the woman she's becoming. One that no longer orbits his validation. One that no longer believes love must be earned through endurance. One that no longer confuses loyalty with losing herself. She has tasted solitude and found it sweeter than the uncertainty he once offered. He thought she needed closure, but what she needed was clarity. Clarity that came not from him, but from her own awakening. The kind of awakening that comes after enough nights of crying into pillows, of shrinking her voice to keep the peace, of abandoning her own instincts to avoid abandonment from him. And once she saw the pattern, she stopped participating in the play. Because women like her don't stay silent to punish. They stay silent to protect. Not from him, but from the version of herself that once tolerated less than she deserved. She no longer runs toward noise disguised as passion. She no longer confuses intensity for intimacy. She has started listening to her nervous system, not just her nostalgia. And her body remembers what her heart used to deny: the ache of waiting, the high cost of hope, the fatigue of fixing someone who never asked to be healed. He remembers the light in her eyes when she still believed. And now he sees that same light, but it's no longer aimed at him. It's inward, rooted, sacred. And that's what breaks him, because he cannot follow her there. He cannot reach the woman who found her wholeness beyond him. He cannot penetrate the fortress built on self-trust. He cannot negotiate with the silence she now wears like armor and altar. He begins to realize that her quiet isn't emptiness. It's sovereignty. It's the space where she plants new truths. The garden where her future will grow, untouched by old wounds. And in that garden, he is not the sun. He is a season that passed, one she no longer mourns, one she no longer measures her growth against, one that taught her, yes, but one she outgrew with grace. He sits with that realization, and for the first time, he doesn't know what to do. Because all the tools that used to work, charm, delay, distance, return, no longer reach her. She's not playing a game, she's living a new life. And the silence between them is no longer a pause. It's a boundary. He sees now what he couldn't see then, that she was never asking too much. She was simply asking the wrong man. Her requests for presence, for honesty, for depth, they were not demands. They were invitations, sacred keys held out with trembling hope that he might walk with her, not ahead of her, that he might meet her in truth, not in tactics, that he might love her without needing to control the shape of her fire. But he mistook her vulnerability for weakness. He mistook her devotion for dependency. And in that blindness, he pushed away the very mirror that could have revealed his deepest shadow. Because her love was not a transaction, it was transformation. But he only knew how to take, not to be changed. So when she withdrew, not in bitterness, but in reverence, he met a silence that screamed louder than any goodbye. It echoed into the chambers of his ego, shaking loose the illusions he had built. The illusion that she would always be there, that her softness was forever his sanctuary, that her heart was a home he could leave and return to as he pleased. But she was not a home. She was a path. And he had walked it in circles until she disappeared into her own horizon. Now he watches from a distance, haunted not by what she said, but by everything she didn't. The unanswered messages, the lack of resistance, the peace in her posture, the elegance of her absence. It's a punishment he cannot negotiate with because it's not a punishment at all. It's a consequence, a quiet conclusion written by her healing, not her hate. Because when a woman stops speaking, it means she has started listening to herself. And that's what makes her silence so potent. It's not empty. It's full of answers he refused to hear. She no longer tells him what he did wrong. She no longer explains the ache. She no longer teaches him how to love her. She lets him learn the lesson on his own, with no syllabus, no scaffold, no savior. And perhaps that's the cruelest kindness of all, because now he is left alone with the version of himself that only existed in her reflection. The man he could have been had he chosen to grow instead of hide. Had he chosen presence over performance, depth over domination, intimacy over influence. He sees her now not as a possession lost, but as a portal closed. And inside that realization, a war begins within him. The boy who still craves control, the man who yearns for connection, the shadow that fears the feminine force he could never fully grasp. It is no longer about winning her back. It is about facing the ghost of who he was when he had her, and who he must become to deserve someone like her in any future that might remain. But by the time most men arrive at this revelation, the feminine has already risen. She has walked through the underworld. She has buried the girl who begged. She has crowned the woman who chooses, not out of spite, but out of sacred evolution. And she knows that love, in its truest form, cannot be coerced or clung to. It cannot be earned through silence-breaking desperation. It must rise in two healed hearts that do not feed on need, but breathe in freedom. That's why her silence broke him, because it held a mirror to his noise, because it exposed his echo chamber, because it whispered, not "come back," but "look within." And that whisper, barely audible, but deafening in impact, became the siren song of his reckoning. She didn't slam the door. She simply walked through one he never noticed. And now, standing in the threshold of his regret, he knows he did not lose her when she left. He lost her the moment she realized she no longer had to explain why she deserved more. There is a sacred moment, rare, irreversible, when a woman no longer waits to be understood. When the thread that tethered her to someone's potential is quietly cut, and her energy, once outwardly given, returns home. That's when the unraveling begins for him. Not because she punished, not because she played games, but because she stopped hoping. And in that stillness, he is faced with the unbearable weight of a reality he never imagined. She is no longer his mirror. He can no longer project his greatness through her admiration, no longer anchor his identity to her loyalty. Her presence no longer inflates his hollow pride. Her silence strips him bare. For so long he believed her power was in her expression, in her words, her emotions, her tears. But the real power was what she withheld, what she chose not to destroy, even when she could, the forgiveness she granted before he asked, the dignity she maintained when humiliation would have been easier. And now that quiet absence becomes louder than any rage. This is the paradox most men never expect. They prepare for fights, for dramatic exits, for harsh words and final screams. But they are not prepared for a woman who walks away without noise, who leaves without slamming doors, who says nothing, not because she's weak, but because she's done negotiating with denial. That's what breaks him, because deep down, he knows she saw him. Not just the curated version, not the mask he wore for the world, but the aching boy beneath the man, the unhealed wound beneath the bravado. And she held it all with grace until the day it began to bleed onto her. When a woman like that walks away, it is not a loss. It is a reckoning. He sees her now through a different lens. Not the one shaped by his comfort, but the one shaped by his absence. He sees her in the way she glows without him, in the way she loves herself louder than she ever loved him quietly, in the way the world leans toward her with reverence, because she no longer leans toward those who make her small. And that reflection is unbearable, because he realizes she didn't need him to become this version of herself. She had to lose him to find her own hands. The same hands that once reached out to pull him closer now hold only herself, with tenderness, with trust, with a kind of unshakable peace that cannot be bought or begged for. This is the death of his illusion, the illusion that she would orbit him indefinitely, that her love was a contract, that her warmth would return the moment he decided to be present. But presence is not performance. To be truly present with a woman like her requires depth, requires ownership, requires the kind of inner courage that most men postpone until life strips them of all their defenses. So he tries to return, not with apologies, but with nostalgia, with the comfort of memory, with the lazy assumption that she might still feel what she once did. But memory fades, and nostalgia is no match for a woman who has met herself. Because when she said nothing, she made the most powerful declaration: I no longer need you to understand me to know who I am. And that is the blade that cuts through every layer of his constructed self. The version of him that was built upon being needed, being chased, being the center of someone else's world. Now she is her own center, and the world that once revolved around him, it's gone still. He sees it in her laughter that no longer dims when he enters a room, in her eyes that no longer scan the crowd for him, in her silence that no longer waits for him to speak first. It is not hatred, it is not bitterness, it is a rebirth. And nothing threatens a man more than a woman who has risen from the ashes he left her in and chosen not to look back. He walks through his memories like a man combing the ruins of a kingdom he once ruled, searching for proof that he mattered, that his crown wasn't made of illusion. But the silence she left behind doesn't echo with longing. It doesn't bend to his footsteps. It resists him, like the earth resists the return of something it has already buried. She is not where he left her. He cannot find her in the stories he once told himself. Not in the version of her who waited, who softened, who forgave before it was deserved. That woman no longer exists. She died quietly, in the spaces where he never showed up, in the moments he thought she'd always be there. And what stands in her place now is a woman carved from truth. Not the kind of truth that screams or proves or performs, but the truth that simply is, solid, unyielding, self-sustained. A woman whose silence does not ask a question, but answers it. A woman who has realized that love is not sacrifice without reciprocity, not patience without progress. He cannot reach her, not because she blocked him, but because she no longer vibrates on the same frequency. She no longer speaks in the dialect of desperation or hope. She speaks only in presence, and his absence taught her a language he doesn't understand. He once confused her stillness for weakness, thought that because she didn't fight, she didn't feel, that her quiet was emptiness, not power. But now he sees the truth. It takes far more strength to walk away without hate than it does to leave screaming. She did not abandon him. She simply stopped betraying herself. And the wound he feels now is not her punishment. It's the echo of his own reflection. For the first time, he sees who he was through the eyes of the one who loved him most. Not the glorified version, but the shadowed one, the avoidant one. The man who stood at the gates of intimacy but never entered, who wanted to be adored without being known. She knew him. And that's what terrifies him. Because when a woman loves you beyond your masks, when she sees the wound under your arrogance, the fear behind your distance, and she still offers you grace only for you to squander it, what she takes when she leaves is not just her body. It's the mirror, the place where you were finally, completely seen. And once that mirror shatters, you are left with only shards. Shards of moments you can't relive. Shards of texts left unread. Shards of memories that won't age well in the absence of a future. Shards of the version of you that only existed because she believed in him. He will try to replace her, not with another woman, but with noise, distractions, validations, illusions of control. He'll scroll, swipe, drink, joke, pretend. But at night, when silence returns to reclaim him, he will remember that it was her silence that taught him what real presence meant. He used to be the center of her world. Now, she is the center of her own, and that shift in gravity leaves him floating in a void of his own making, detached, disoriented, alone. Not because she left, but because he never arrived. She doesn't speak his name with resentment. She doesn't curse him. She doesn't rewrite the story to cast herself as victim. She simply no longer writes him into the narrative of her becoming. He is a chapter closed, a lesson embodied, a path not chosen. And this is what truly breaks him. Not that she hates him, but that she doesn't need to, because the woman who said nothing said everything. With her silence, she told the truth. That she is not a test to pass, a prize to win, or a fallback option. She is the threshold he wasn't ready to cross. The storm he avoided. The healing he postponed. And now, she is the peace he cannot disturb. He once believed that a woman's silence was merely space to return to. That if he walked away long enough, she would still be there, on the same page, in the same place, heart ajar, arms still holding the ghost of him. That her patience was infinite, that her love made her linger. But what he never understood is that feminine silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is metamorphosis, because when a woman goes quiet, not in fear, not in bitterness, but in clarity, it is the sound of her soul reorganizing. It is her withdrawing her energy from places that leak. It is the beginning of her no longer asking to be seen, but deciding to see herself. She gave him the chance to meet her where she truly lived, in her vulnerability, in her depth, in the corners of her being that few are ever allowed to enter. But he hovered. He didn't enter. He circled her soul like a man unsure of his own worth, scared that once he was seen, he would lose the illusion of control. And now control is the very thing he's lost. Because nothing frightens the uninitiated man more than a woman who no longer reacts, no longer explains, no longer waits to be chosen. A woman whose absence feels louder than her presence ever did. A woman who, through her silence, exposes everything he refused to confront. He underestimated the power of stillness. He forgot that quiet is where transformation occurs, that seeds sprout in darkness, that identities collapse in silence before being reborn. She was not passive. She was evolving. While he sought comfort in distraction, she sought wholeness in solitude, and the ground beneath her shifted. He thought she would reach out first. He thought the silence would crumble her. But she was not weakened by the pause. She became precise. She stopped performing love and started embodying it. She stopped begging for reciprocity and became the source of her own validation. She stopped dimming her light to accommodate someone afraid of being seen. He once loved her dependence. It made him feel needed, central, powerful. But what he did not realize was that her dependence was never on him. It was on the idea of who he could become, on the potential she kept believing in long after reality stopped confirming it. And when she finally stopped needing that dream, she stopped needing him. There's a unique grief that comes for a man when he realizes she didn't stop loving him. She just started loving herself more. It's a grief rooted in missed moments and invisible wounds. In all the words he didn't say, the embraces he pulled away from, the days he vanished behind distractions. It is the grief of seeing her eyes in memory, not in reality. The grief of realizing that her silence was not meant to punish, but to protect. He begins to understand that she didn't withhold closure. She became her own. That she didn't reject him. She just no longer tolerates fragments. That she didn't turn cold. She simply returned home to herself. She no longer scans the horizon waiting for his return. She no longer interprets his silence as mystery or depth. She no longer places her intuition on mute just to keep him comfortable. Instead, she holds herself with the kind of love she once gave away for free. This is the moment he truly sees her, not through the lens of possession, but through the aching clarity of absence. And what he sees is not someone who forgot him, but someone who finally remembered herself. And that is what breaks him. Because the real loss is not her body, her voice, or her love. It is the loss of who he was in her eyes before he betrayed the reflection. She loved him in a way that made him feel real. In a way that mirrored his light, even when he only showed her shadow. In a way that whispered, "You are more than your wounds." And when she went silent, that mirror vanished. And now he is left with the task he spent years avoiding, facing himself without her belief as a shield. So he sits in the silence he once mistook for absence, and realizes it was always full. Full of the woman he didn't meet halfway. Full of the love he mistook for dependency. Full of the grace he assumed would never expire. But now, it's gone. He stares into the vacuum she left behind, hoping for echoes, some trace of her still lingering in the corners of his life. But there is only stillness. Not the kind that invites him back, but the kind that tells him the chapter is closed. And still, he doesn't quite understand how silence could hurt more than words. He doesn't yet grasp that when a woman stops speaking, it's not because she has nothing left to say. It's because she has already said everything. Words are the currency of the ego. But silence belongs to the soul. When she chose not to argue, not to plead, not to unravel herself in front of him anymore, she didn't become smaller. She became sacred. Her silence was not absence, but ascension. It was her stepping outside of the dynamic that kept her spinning in circles, waiting to be seen by someone who refused to look. For years, she made herself into poetry he refused to read. Now she writes in a language only the self-aware can understand. He once thought her silence was emptiness, but now he begins to feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He realizes it is a mirror, reflecting every wound he never addressed. The very stillness he thought would be his relief becomes the terrain of his unraveling. Men who live on the surface drown in depth when they are finally left alone in it. Because when a woman goes silent, what fills that space is not nothingness. It's everything. Every overlooked moment, every dismissed feeling, every fragment of herself she handed over, hoping he would cherish it. And now, it all returns. Not to him, but to her. And it breaks him. Not because she's gone, but because he never truly showed up. It is the ancient tragedy of the masculine that confuses presence with possession, and only realizes the value of the feminine when it's no longer held in proximity. He begins to see that she was never waiting for him to save her. She was waiting to be met. And when that didn't happen, she stopped waiting altogether. She didn't slam the door. She didn't leave a dramatic note. She didn't shatter his world with fire. She walked away with grace, with quiet. She evaporated like morning mist, gone before he even knew he should have been holding on. And that is what haunts him most, because no closure will ever be enough for the man who made her feel like an option, only to realize she was the whole path. He replays the last moment he saw her eyes, now realizing there was something different in them, something final. The soft glow of someone who no longer needs to prove, to fight, to explain. The look of a woman who has made peace with her own heart and decided to protect it from further erosion. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to make him suffer. She just wanted her energy back. And once she reclaimed it, the dynamic shifted. The power he thought he had was revealed as borrowed. Her love had been the current that carried their connection. When it was removed, he was left swimming in still water, no longer buoyed by her belief in him. He realizes now that her silence was not the absence of emotion, but the culmination of it. It was the full stop to the sentence she had rewritten in her soul too many times. He sees her differently now, not as the woman who once adored him, but as the woman who outgrew the need to. And in this new vision, he meets her not as a lover, but as a lesson. Some women don't leave to be chaste. Some women leave to be free. And when that happens, it is not thunder that announces their departure. It is quiet. A quiet so vast and final, it echoes louder than rage ever could. He feels it now. In the mornings, she used to fill with warmth. In the silence where her voice once wrapped around the spaces between moments. In the way the air no longer carries her scent, yet everything reminds him of her. But this is not her burden anymore. It is his. His to unravel, his to sit with, his to finally confront. Because she did not vanish. She evolved. He cannot reach her now, not because she's hidden, but because she's risen. There is no ladder tall enough to touch the soul of a woman who no longer roots her worth in a man's recognition. No apology grand enough to summon her back from the garden she's begun to grow within herself. He sees her now as a myth, a mystery, a muse. Not because she changed into someone else, but because he never truly saw her as she was. He had mistaken her softness for submission, her nurturing for naivety. And now that she's gone, he mistakes her silence for cruelty, unable to grasp that it is, in fact, mercy. For silence does not humiliate. It merely holds up the mirror. And what a man sees there depends entirely on the depth he's willing to face within himself. She said nothing, but in doing so, she said everything. She said, I am no longer willing to barter my peace for proximity. She said, I have outgrown the ache of being misunderstood. She said, I choose myself, not as a weapon, but as a vow. And now, in the void her silence left behind, he begins to encounter a different kind of sound, the voice of his own unresolved self. the parts of him that recoiled from intimacy, that feared her strength, that flinched every time she tried to love him deeply. You see, a man who hasn't faced his own inner child will run from any woman who tries to love him like a grown one. Because real love doesn't just soothe, it reflects. It doesn't just embrace, it demands truth. And for him, that truth was unbearable. She reminded him of the mother wound he never named, the emotional neglect he normalized, the expectations he placed on women to heal what he refused to hold in himself. But she didn't come to be his therapist. She came to walk beside him, not drag him behind. So when she stopped speaking, when she withdrew her warmth and her wonder, it wasn't because she wanted power over him. It was because she realized he didn't want to meet her as an equal, and no amount of pleading or explaining could build a bridge over the chasm between presence and performance. Now he walks through rooms that echo her absence, not because she took something from him, but because her energy had become interwoven with his days. And when she left, she didn't unravel his life. She revealed how much of it depended on hers. He's haunted not by what she said, but by what he never listened to when she did. He thinks about the way her voice used to tremble, not from weakness, but from the effort of trying to be heard without becoming hard. How she tried to remain soft while his indifference sharpened her edges. How she bent until bending became breaking, and even then, she stayed. Until one day she didn't, and the silence that followed wasn't sudden. It had been approaching for months, perhaps years. The quiet wasn't an explosion, it was erosion. Subtle, persistent. A slow retreat of a woman realizing that love is not enough when it's not reciprocal. He remembers her final gaze, not angry, not desperate, just done. That look doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it doesn't negotiate. It simply says, I gave what I could, and I refuse to give what costs me myself. Now, he sits with the pieces. But this is not a story of heartbreak, it is a story of reckoning. Because sometimes a woman's greatest act of love is her exit. Not because she stopped caring, but because she finally started caring for herself more. This is the grief of the man who sees too late. The grief of realizing that the woman he once thought he had time to figure out was actually the mirror he refused to face. She no longer dances in the illusions he built. She no longer bleeds to prove her sincerity. She no longer waits at the gates of his potential, praying he will rise. She has entered the temple of her own becoming, and in her silence, she has found the sacred. He never understood that the most deafening sound in a man's life is the silence of the woman who once believed in him. She had looked at him not through the lens of who he was, but who he could become. And in that gaze, he was exalted, offered the rare and holy opportunity to rise not just as a partner, but as a conscious man. But he mistook her belief for need. He thought she needed him to be whole, to feel beautiful, to be complete. He was wrong. She didn't need him. She chose him. And that distinction is what undoes him now. For what is more terrifying than realizing you were never essential, only invited? She was a sovereign woman, her heart a sanctuary, her mind a labyrinth of fire and water, storm and stillness. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was seeking reverence. And when he failed to bring it, when he offered comfort without commitment, attention without devotion, desire without depth, she finally offered him nothing in return. Because a woman who has done her shadow work no longer confuses connection with survival. She no longer mistakes chemistry for compatibility or loneliness for love. She knows the ache of staying too long in places that can't meet her. And she knows the peace that comes when she walks away anyway. This is what breaks him, not her absence, but what it implies. That she woke up one day and no longer needed his approval, his presence, his validation. That she could breathe without his arms, laugh without his gaze, heal without his apology, and worst of all, grow without his permission. He sees her now, perhaps through the fog of social media, perhaps through the memory that haunts his sleep. She's softer, brighter, more alive than he remembers. Not because someone else has filled the space he once occupied, but because she reclaimed it for herself. She nourished the soil of her own soul. She tended to her wounds without spectacle. She grieved in silence, and then she bloomed. She said nothing, but her life began to speak for her. And that is what undoes him. The proof that her power never came from proximity to a man, but from her unshakable commitment to herself. You see, most men are not broken by a woman's words. They're broken by her evolution. When she stops explaining herself, when she stops performing her pain, when she stops hoping he'll notice, and simply becomes. He might attempt a return. Some do. A late-night message, a cryptic song, a nostalgic photo sent like bait. But she has learned that the man who only remembers her in her absence is the same man who never truly saw her in her presence. So she does not answer, not out of malice, but out of clarity. Because once a woman has remembered her wholeness, she doesn't lower her frequency to remind him of hers. He, on the other hand, is left with the echo of her laughter, of her light, of the life she built while he delayed. And maybe, just maybe, he begins his own journey inward. Maybe her silence becomes the mirror that finally breaks his illusion. Maybe in losing her, he finds the doorway back to himself. But that is no longer her burden to bear. She carried him in ways he never noticed. She softened the world so he could rest. She held space, time, and truth until it bled her dry. And when she stopped, the collapse began. Because the silence of a woman is not empty. It is a full declaration. It is the final act of love toward herself. It is the sacred boundary where her soul says no more. No more waiting, no more trying, no more explaining, just becoming. And in that becoming, she is no longer the woman who begged to be understood. She is the woman who walks away, and in doing so, becomes unforgettable. He remembers her now in fragments, like echoes in a canyon he once refused to enter, not because it was too dark, but because it demanded too much truth. There was a softness in her that terrified him, not because it was weak, but because it mirrored everything he had buried: vulnerability, devotion, reverence. She didn't just want his body, she wanted his presence. She didn't crave his attention. She yearned for his integrity. And now she is no longer offering either. What shakes a man to his core is not the absence of a woman's love. It is the realization that he mishandled a sacred opportunity. She had given him more than affection. She had given him the chance to become more than the sum of his wounds, to step into a greater version of himself, to emerge from boyhood into manhood, through the gateway of accountability and truth. But he wasn't ready, not for the mirror she held up, not for the weight of being truly seen, not for the surrender required to love a woman who has done her healing, because she would not be conquered, she would not be manipulated by silence, nor swayed by grand empty gestures. Her soul required consistency, her heart required depth, her mind demanded realness. He chose comfort over courage, and now he watches from the edges of a life that no longer includes him. There is something haunting about a woman who withdraws with grace. No drama, no destruction, no final words dipped in bitterness. Just nothing. Because a woman who has reclaimed her worth does not waste it on explanations. He sees it in the way she walks now, steadier, unhurried, rooted. He sees it in the way she laughs, without the dull ache of waiting for him to notice. He sees it in the absence of her eyes searching for his approval, and it wrecks him. She was once an open book he never bothered to read. Now she is a closed chapter written in a language he can no longer understand. Do you understand what this does to a man? It awakens him, or destroys him, because for the first time he's not just mourning her presence. He's mourning the version of himself that could have become whole beside her. And he realizes too late that she was not asking him to complete her. She was offering to walk beside him as equals, as mirrors, as partners in a sacred becoming. But the boy inside him chose escape, and the man he could have been was never born. Now he sits in the wreckage of his own delays, trying to piece together the reasons she no longer answers. But the answer is simple. She outgrew the waiting room. She stopped loving on potential. She stopped apologizing for needing more. And in her silence, she found her voice. You may think silence is passive, but in a world that teaches women to explain, to defend, to soften themselves for the comfort of others, silence is rebellion. And he knows it. He knows that when she fell quiet, something seismic shifted. Not just in their connection, but in the foundation of who she is. She no longer begs. She no longer proves. She no longer makes herself small to be digestible. She expands. He hears about her now, perhaps from friends or whispered conversations. She's exploring the world again. She's rediscovering art, music, movement. She's falling in love with mornings, with solitude, with herself. She is no longer orbiting him. She is her own sun. And though he may try to return, bearing the same charm, the same broken promises repackaged as revelations, he will not find the space he once occupied. Because once a woman fills the emptiness she used to outsource to a man, there is no vacancy left for half-heartedness. He could have been part of her kingdom, but he chose to remain a tourist. And now the gates have closed, not in bitterness, but in sovereignty. And that, more than her silence, is what truly breaks him. He carries her absence like a phantom limb. No visible wound, but a constant ache he can't explain. It haunts him not because she vanished, but because she vanished without collapse. There was no explosion, no desperate farewell, no curtain call, just her stillness, just her decision. And in that silence he met himself, perhaps for the first time without her as a shield, without her devotion as anesthesia. The woman who used to absorb his emotional avoidance, who used to stretch her own needs thin to accommodate his unreadiness, no longer stands between him and his own shadows. Now they sit beside him, unfiltered, undistracted, unforgiving. He remembers when she used to ask him to meet her in depth. He remembers her eyes, searching, pleading, burning, not for control, but for connection. She once whispered her fears into his hands. She once let him see the cracks in her soul, not as flaws, but as sacred invitations. He dismissed them. He told himself she was too sensitive, too demanding, too much. But in truth, she was simply aware, awake in ways he wasn't yet ready to be. And that frightened him more than he'd ever admit. So he projected, he distanced, he minimized, because to stand in front of a woman who knows her worth is to be invited into wholeness or exposed in your fragmentation. And now she no longer carries his emotional debt. She's walked away from the version of herself that needed him to grow. She has mourned the potential. She has shed the illusion. And in its place, she has become the very force he once feared. A woman untethered from his validation. This is what he sees now, and it undoes him. He sees her laughing at something someone else said. Not because she's moved on to another man, but because she's moved back to herself. Her eyes sparkle again, but not for him. Her voice no longer trembles at the thought of abandonment. She has already survived it. She has already abandoned herself once for him. And she will never do it again. Do you understand the power of that? The world tells women to make noise when they leave, to rage, to scream, to burn the bridge as a sign of strength. But the deepest power is in the quiet exit. No goodbye, no closure, no performance. Just the reclamation of energy. He thought she would stay long enough for him to get it right. That love meant endurance. That love meant waiting for him to finally choose her fully. But love evolved in her. It no longer begged. It no longer tolerated potential. It no longer asked for crumbs disguised as effort. She no longer aches for a man to see her value, because she sees it herself now in the mirror, in the mornings, in the quiet strength of choosing peace over potential. And in that radiant self-possession, he sees what he lost. Not just her body, not just her laughter, not just the comfort of being wanted. He sees what could have been. He sees the man he might have become in her presence. Had he dared to meet her in the space of mutual growth? Had he dared to rise instead of retreat? Because that's what she was offering. Not rescue, but resurrection. And now it is gone. The moment passed. The invitation expired. The gates closed. And all that remains is the echo of her silence, the silence that holds the memory of a woman who once loved him deeply enough to wait, and who now loves herself deeply enough to walk away. She said nothing, and that's what broke him. He hears her silence in the most unexpected places, between the beats of his favorite song, in the soft hush of nightfall, in the pause between someone else's words, when they don't reach as deeply as hers once did. It is not the noise of her departure that unsettles him. It is the space she left behind, a space he thought he could fill with distractions, with conquest, with bravado. But all the substitutes taste like ash in his mouth, because she didn't leave as the wounded girl begging for love. She left as the woman who finally remembered her power. And now, when he sees her, if he sees her, he cannot unsee what she has become, a mirror to everything he has yet to face within himself. She no longer reflects his ego. She no longer cushions his inadequacies. She no longer shapes herself to fit the hollows of his refusal. She simply stands, whole, unshaken, and that image torments him. Not because she's cruel, but because she's complete. It's a kind of completeness that makes him question his own definition of masculinity. No longer can he soothe himself with dominance or charm. She's past being impressed by surface strength. What moves her now is depth, truth that bleeds, presence that anchors, vulnerability that terrifies most men because it cannot be faked. She used to cry when he dismissed her feelings. Now she doesn't flinch when he ignores her. She used to write long messages, trying to explain her heart. Now she leaves it unread, not out of malice, but out of clarity. Some connections are not meant to be rewritten. Some chapters end not because the story wasn't beautiful, but because the main character finally chose to survive. And survival, true survival, is not just about endurance. It's about evolution. She no longer waits for his what if. She lives in her what's next. And in doing so, she transforms into the archetype he cannot conquer, the high priestess, the one who knows and says nothing, the one who sees through projection, through sweet words spoken too late, the one who holds the chalice of truth and will not pour it out for the unready. He now sees what he mistook for weakness was the kind of strength that does not roar. It simply endures, quietly, gracefully, until it no longer needs to. Because she did love him, fiercely, but she also loved herself enough to learn that the man who cannot meet her in her silence does not deserve her in her song. Now his dreams betray him. He sees her in the blurred space between memory and regret. He imagines what he would say, how he would hold her, how he would listen, really listen, if only he had the chance again. But silence doesn't rewind time. It doesn't barter. It doesn't explain. It liberates. And in this liberation, she doesn't hate him. She simply no longer needs him to become the woman she was always meant to be. He thought her silence was punishment, but it was prophecy. She had become the woman who walks without noise and leaves earthquakes in her absence. Now he's left to sit with the ruins of his own avoidance, not because she broke him, but because in the end, she didn't have to. And so he wanders, not just through the external world of routines and responsibilities, but through the crumbling halls of his inner architecture. The temples he once built on ego are now ash and echoes. Every step forward drags behind it the ghost of what she awakened in him. Not her body, not her presence, But her absence, that is what echoes, that is what haunts. Because in that absence, he finally sees what he had refused to see. The mirror she held up to him was never cruel. It was never judging. It simply reflected the truth. And the truth was this: he had always been afraid of the kind of love that demanded his full presence, the kind that called him to rise, to feel, to be still. Now he realizes something brutal. Her silence was not a tactic. It was her evolution. She no longer spoke because there was nothing left to explain. No more pieces of herself to carve out and hand over for him to maybe, someday, understand. She grew weary of being the translator of her own soul, so she chose peace. And peace is often mistaken for coldness by those who only know chaos. But he knows now. He knows that the day she said nothing, truly nothing, was the day she said everything. That stillness shattered him more than any scream ever could, because he knew in that sacred silence he had finally lost access. Not just to her time, not just to her affection. He lost access to her hope. And once a woman withdraws her hope, she is no longer in orbit. She becomes a world unto herself, a quiet golden galaxy that you no longer have the coordinates to reach. He tries to go on, tries to touch other women, hoping their softness might dissolve the memory of her depth. But it doesn't. They are kind, these other women. Some are beautiful, some laugh too loudly, some give too easily, but none of them carry the mystery that she did. None of them mirror back his shadow like she once did, because she saw him, and that terrified him more than any rejection. She saw the boy behind the man, the fear behind the anger, the fragility behind the mask, and instead of using it against him, she held it gently, until the day she realized he didn't want to be held. He only wanted to be admired. Admiration is easy. It keeps one distant, untouchable. But intimacy, that's war. That's surrender. That's real. And he wasn't ready. She was. Now, long after the messages have stopped, long after her presence has faded from his days, he finds himself thinking less about what he lost and more about who he might have become if he had been brave enough to stand in the fire she offered. She wasn't asking him to burn for her. She was asking him to burn with her, to become something more than flesh and pride. But silence doesn't repeat its invitation. It doesn't knock again. It moves on, graceful and unreachable. And she, in her stillness, has become the storm he never saw coming. A woman who needed nothing, and in that nothing held everything. He used to believe that silence meant weakness, that the louder voice wins, that the last word proves power. But hers wasn't a silence of defeat. It was a silence of arrival. She had arrived at herself. He mistook her pause for hesitation, her quiet for waiting. But the truth he now realizes in the slow ache of hindsight is this: when a woman stops speaking, stops explaining, stops reaching, she isn't waiting. She's done. And when she's done, something ancient stirs in the man who never thought she would walk away. Now he understands that silence is not emptiness. Silence is sacred space. The kind of space a woman carves out when she has cried her last tear in private and whispered her final prayer into the ceiling fan at 3 a.m., wondering what more she could have done, who else she needed to become, what wound she had to heal in him so he could finally see her. But healing him was never hers to do. That was the lie she finally stopped swallowing. And the moment she stopped bending herself into explanations he was never ready to receive, he felt the air shift. He felt the energy pull back like the tide leaving a shore. Gentle, slow, but absolute. This is what broke him. Not her rage, not her demands, but her absence from the battlefield. Because for a man who feeds on emotional war, peace is the most disarming thing in the world. A woman who will no longer fight for him doesn't hate him. She has transcended him. And that's what he never prepared for. He was armed for arguments, trained for manipulation, comfortable in chaos. But he had no defense for detachment, for indifference laced with grace, for a love that could hold him fiercely, but also release him completely. She said nothing, but her silence echoed with centuries of feminine wisdom. It whispered what generations of women have known in their bones: that loving someone does not mean sacrificing yourself on their altar of unreadiness. He sees now that she didn't need him to become perfect. She needed him to become present, to meet her in the deep, to witness her without flinching, to hold space for the wild, the soft, the breaking, and the divine inside her. But he stayed on the surface, and in doing so, he drowned in his own shallow waters while she swam to shore alone. She built herself a temple in that silence, one brick at a time, made of boundaries instead of bargaining, standards instead of sorrow. And now, when he sees her again,